The wind howled softly through the pine trees surrounding Evelyn's little wooden house in suburban Oregon, a sound she used to love but now barely noticed. At 72, Evelyn wasn't the spry, energetic woman she once was. Her days as a high school biology teacher were long behind her, replaced by a quieter life, one that felt emptier since her husband, Tom, passed away 3 years ago. The house, once filled with laughter and the smell of his famous chili simmering on the stove, now sat still, its creaky floors echoing her solitude. She'd wake up each morning, shuffle to the kitchen in her faded slippers, and brew a pot of coffee that would sit untouched until it went cold. Lately, she'd been forgetting things: where she parked her old Toyota, the name of the neighbor's dog, even what day it was. Her knees ached, her eyes strained to read the fine print on her beloved nature books, and a creeping tiredness seemed to cling to her bones. "Do you ever wonder," she whispered to herself one gray March morning, staring out the fogged-up window, "how much time you've got left?" It wasn't the first time the question had crossed her mind, but today it felt heavier, like a stone sinking into the still waters of her thoughts. At 72, Evelyn wasn't afraid of dying, not exactly, but she was terrified of fading away, of becoming a shadow of the woman who once hiked the Oregon trails with Tom, sketching wildflowers in her notebooks. She wanted more years, yes, but more than that, she wanted good years. Years worth living. That's when it happened. She was flipping through a podcast app on her phone, something her granddaughter had set up for her last Christmas, when a title caught her eye. 6 Everyday Habits That Predict How Long You'll Live After 70, backed by science. The host's voice crackled through her earbuds, warm and urgent. "Experts agree. Folks, it's not just about genetics or luck. The little things you do every single day could be adding years to your life or stealing them away. Stay tuned to find out what they are." Evelyn froze, her coffee mug halfway to her lips. Could it really be that simple? Could the way she lived her quiet, predictable days be the key to how many more sunrises she'd see? She set the mug down, hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from a spark of something she hadn't felt in years: curiosity. Evelyn had always been a seeker, a collector of knowledge. Her bookshelves sagged under the weight of dusty volumes about birds, trees, and the secret lives of forests. She'd spent her career teaching kids to ask questions, to dig deeper. And now, here she was, facing the biggest question of all: what am I doing wrong? She grabbed a pen and an old spiral notebook, the kind she used to jot lesson plans in, and pressed play again. The podcast promised to reveal 6 habits, 6 simple, everyday choices that could hint at how many years she had left. "Okay," she muttered, tapping the pen against the page. "Let's see what you've got." The first thing that hit her wasn't the habits themselves, it was the realization of how far she'd drifted. She thought back to her mornings, skipping breakfast because she wasn't hungry, sitting on the couch for hours watching reruns of Jeopardy, letting the phone ring because talking to anyone felt like too much effort. She glanced around the room. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and neglect. A stack of unopened mail teetered on the counter. Her favorite armchair bore the permanent imprint of her body, a testament to how little she moved. "This isn't living," she said aloud, her voice cracking. "This is waiting." The podcast host's words echoed in her head. Habit number 1. What you put in your body matters. Evelyn's diet lately? Canned soup, toast, maybe a banana if she remembered to buy one. She hadn't cooked a real meal since Tom died, too much work for one person. She pictured him in the kitchen, apron tied around his waist, teasing her about her rabbit food salads while he chopped onions. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back. The host went on. "Studies from the National Institute on Aging show that a diet rich in vegetables can lower your risk of heart disease and dementia, 2 big killers after 70. Vegetables. Evelyn couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten anything green that didn't come from a can. Then came habit 2. Move your body, even just a little. The host cited research: 30 minutes of walking a day could cut her risk of early death by nearly 20%. Evelyn used to love walking. She and Tom would wander the misty trails near their home, breathing in the sharp scent of pine, laughing as they raced each other to the top of a hill. Now, she barely made it to the mailbox without her knees complaining. The thought of lacing up her sneakers felt laughable, impossible. And habit 3. Sleep isn't a luxury, it's a lifeline. 7 to 9 hours a night, the expert said, could keep her brain sharp and her heart strong. Evelyn's nights were a mess. She'd stay up past midnight, the TV flickering, then wake at dawn feeling like she'd been hit by a truck. She'd lie in bed, staring at the empty space where Tom used to sleep, memories keeping her awake until exhaustion won out. She paused the podcast, her heart pounding. 3 habits in, and she was already failing. Was this why she felt so tired, so foggy, so old? She flipped open one of her nature books, running her fingers over a faded illustration of a redwood tree. These things live for centuries, she murmured. What's my secret? What's keeping me going or holding me back? The podcast had promised 6 habits, but she couldn't listen to the rest not yet. She needed to sit with this, to let it sink in. Evelyn stood up, her joints creaking like the floorboards, and shuffled to the window. The Oregon fog hung low, wrapping the pines in a ghostly shroud. She thought about her life, how it had shrunk to these 4 walls, how she'd let herself fade into the background. You've got to do something, she told herself, gripping the windowsill. But what? Where do you even start? That's when the question hit her, sharp and clear. Have you ever stopped to think about the tiny habits shaping your days? The ones that might be deciding how many years you've got left? She didn't have answers, not yet, but for the first time in a long time, she wanted them. She picked up her notebook, scribbled habit 1, eat better. Habit 2, move. Habit 3, sleep, and stared at the page. The podcast had planted a seed, and though it scared her, it also lit something inside her, a flicker of hope, a whisper of fight. Evelyn didn't know it then, but this was the beginning. The beginning of a journey that would test her, break her open, and maybe, just maybe, give her back the years she thought she'd lost. The next morning, Evelyn woke with a fire in her chest she hadn't felt since her teaching days. The Oregon fog pressed against the windows, thick and gray, but inside her little wooden house, something was shifting. She sat at the kitchen table, her old spiral notebook open, the words eat better, move, sleep staring back at her in her shaky handwriting. The podcast's promise echoed in her mind. 6 everyday habits could hint at how many years she had left after 70. She'd heard 3 so far, and they'd hit her like a freight train. Okay, Evelyn, she muttered, tying her gray hair into a loose bun. You're not dead yet. Let's see if this works. She started with the first habit, eating better. The National Institute on Aging said a diet rich in vegetables could fend off heart disease and keep her brain from turning to mush. Evelyn glanced at her pantry: canned soup, a stale box of crackers, a jar of peanut butter she couldn't open without a fight. Vegetables, she said aloud, as if testing the word. She hadn't grown anything since Tom died, but their backyard, wild and overgrown, now used to have a small garden. She pictured his hands in the dirt, pulling up carrots while she laughed at his muddy knees. The memory stung, but it also pushed her forward. With a rusty trowel and a packet of kale seeds she found in a drawer, Evelyn shuffled outside. The air smelled of wet pine and earth, and the damp soaked through her slippers. She knelt, her knees protesting, and dug into the soil. It was harder than she remembered. Her hands shook, and the cold bit into her fingers. But after an hour, she had a patchy row of seeds planted. There, she panted, wiping sweat from her brow. Step 1. She imagined the kale sprouting, green and vibrant, a little piece of life she could claim as her own. For a moment, she felt proud until the next day, when she spotted tiny bugs chewing through her work. You've got to be kidding me, she groaned, staring at the ruined leaves. Was this a sign? Was she too old to start over? Next up, moving her body. The podcast said 30 minutes of walking a day could slash her risk of dying early. 30 minutes, she scoffed, lacing up her sneakers for the first time in years. I can barely make it to the mailbox. But she remembered the trails she and Tom used to hike, the way the Oregon pines stretched endlessly overhead, their needles carpeting the ground. She grabbed her coat and stepped onto the path behind her house, the one she'd avoided since he'd been gone. The air was crisp, the fog lifting just enough to reveal the towering trees. She walked slowly, her breath puffing out in little clouds. 5 minutes in, her knees ached. 10 minutes, and her chest tightened. By 15, she stopped, leaning against a tree, gasping. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, tears burning her eyes. "I can't do this." Back home, she collapsed into her armchair, the familiar dent welcoming her like an old friend. Her sneakers stayed on, mud streaking the floor, a silent testament to her failure. She flipped open one of her nature books, tracing the illustration of a sparrow in flight. "You don't have to worry about sore knees, do you?" she whispered. The podcast had made it sound so easy, just walk. But her body wasn't cooperating, and the weight of that hit her hard. She scribbled in her notebook, "Day 1, walked 15 minutes. Felt like dying." Then came sleep. 7 to 9 hours, the experts said, could keep her sharp and strong. That night, Evelyn turned off the TV at 9 p.m., a miracle in itself, and climbed into bed. The silence was deafening. Without the hum of late-night game shows, her thoughts roared. She stared at Tom's side of the bed, the pillow still dented from years of his head resting there. Memories flooded in. His snores, his arm draped over her, the way he'd mumble about lesson plans in his sleep. She tossed and turned, the clock ticking past midnight, then 1 a.m. When she finally drifted off, nightmares jolted her awake, Tom calling her name. But she couldn't find him in the fog. She woke at dawn, eyes gritty, feeling worse than before. "Great," she grumbled, scribbling in her notebook. Slept 4 hours. Haunted. Days turned into a week, and Evelyn kept trying. She replanted the kale, this time with a makeshift net to keep the bugs away. She walked again, pushing to 20 minutes before her knees screamed. She tried sleeping with the window open, letting the sound of the wind drown out the silence. But every step felt like a battle. Her hands trembled as she held her coffee mug, her eyes blurred when she tried to read her books, and her heart ached with every memory of Tom that slipped through the cracks. "Is this worth it?" she asked herself one rainy afternoon, staring at the muddy garden through the window. "Am I fooling myself, thinking I can change?" She sat down with her notebook, flipping through her messy notes. Kale, half dead. Walk, barely alive. Sleep, a disaster. The podcast had promised hope, but all she felt was defeat. She pictured the host's voice. 3 more habits to go. But she wasn't sure she could keep going. Her body hurt, her spirit sagged, and the quiet of her house felt heavier than ever. She closed the notebook, her fingers lingering on the cover. "Maybe I'm too late," she whispered. "Maybe this is all I've got left." But then, something stopped her, a flicker of stubbornness, the same spark that had gotten her through decades of rowdy classrooms. She opened the notebook again, picked up her pen, and wrote, "Not giving up yet." She didn't know if she believed it, but she wanted to. She wanted to know what the other 3 habits were, what they might unlock. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only one struggling with this. Hey, if you're watching this right now, her story seems to pause, as if she's looking right at you through the screen. I want you to do something for me. If you've made it this far, drop a 2 in the comments below. And tell me, do you think I should keep going? Should Evelyn push through? Or is it okay to call it quits? I'd love to hear what you'd do in her shoes. Her voice, imagined through the tale, carries a raw edge, a plea for connection. She's not just a character anymore, she's a mirror, reflecting the quiet battles so many fight after 70. Evelyn didn't know it yet, but those first shaky steps were planting something deeper than kale seeds. They were rooting her back into life, one stubborn stumble at a time. She turned on the podcast again, her finger hovering over the play button. 3 habits down, 3 to go. Could they really change everything? Or was she chasing a ghost, a version of herself she'd never get back? The rain tapped against the roof, steady and relentless, as she pressed play. The rain had stopped, leaving the Oregon air heavy with the scent of wet pine and earth. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, the podcast humming through her earbuds, her notebook open to a fresh page. Her kale patch was still a mess. Her walks still ended in sore knees, and sleep remained a restless dance with ghosts. But something had shifted after that week of stumbles, something small, stubborn, and alive. She'd written "not giving up yet" in her notebook, and those words clung to her like moss on a tree. She pressed play, ready for the next 3 habits. If the first 3 had shaken her awake, maybe these could pull her forward. The podcast host's voice crackled with energy. Habit number 4: stay connected. Loneliness kills faster than you think. Evelyn's chest tightened. Harvard Health Studies, the host said, showed that strong social ties could lower blood pressure, boost immunity, even add years to your life. She thought of her phone, silent for days unless her granddaughter called. Since Tom died, she'd let friendships fade, dodging invitations until people stopped asking. The idea of reaching out now felt absurd, her voice rusty from disuse, her stories stuck in the past. But the host's words stuck. It's not about having a crowd. It's about one real connection. That afternoon, Evelyn drove to the local library in town, a squat brick building she'd avoided for years. They hosted a book club every Thursday, and she'd seen the flyer pinned to the bulletin board at the grocery store. She clutched one of her nature books, a worn copy about Pacific Northwest birds, and stepped inside. The room smelled of old paper and coffee, and a dozen faces turned to her, curious but kind. "I'm Evelyn," she said, her voice cracking like dry wood. "I like books about nature." A woman with silver hair and a warm smile, Margaret, patted the seat next to her. "Sit here, Han. We're just starting." They talked about a novel Evelyn hadn't read, but when she shyly mentioned a fact about ospreys from her book, the group leaned in, nodding. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Habit 5 came next: manage your stress, or it'll manage you. The podcast cited meditation 5 minutes a day could calm the mind and cut the risk of stroke, according to Harvard. Evelyn snorted. "Meditation? Me?" She pictured hippies in flowing robes, not a creaky old woman in a plaid sweater. But that night, she found a free YouTube video, 5-minute guided meditation for beginners. She sat on her couch, the Oregon pines swaying outside, and followed the soft voice. Breathe in, breathe out. Her mind raced. Tom's laugh, the buggy kale, her aching knees, but slowly, it quieted. The wind rustled through the trees, and for 5 minutes, she felt a stillness she'd forgotten was possible. When the video ended, she opened her eyes, surprised to find tears on her cheeks, not sad ones, but something softer, lighter. The 6th habit hit hardest: quit the poison. "Smoking," the host said, "shaved years off your life, plain and simple." Evelyn hadn't smoked much since her 40s, but after Tom died, she'd picked up the habit again. Just a cigarette or 2 on the porch, the smoke curling into the fog, a bitter comfort. The podcast didn't sugarcoat it. Every puff was a thief, stealing her breath, her years. She stubbed out the half-smoked cigarette in her ashtray that night, hands shaking. "No more," she whispered, tossing the pack into the trash. The next morning, the craving clawed at her, but she brewed tea instead, gripping the mug until it passed. "I'm not letting you win," she told the empty room. Days turned into weeks, and Evelyn kept at it. She went back to the book club, her voice growing steadier each time. Margaret invited her for tea, and they swapped stories about their husbands, laughter mixing with tears. Evelyn meditated every evening, the 5 minutes stretching to 10, the stillness seeping into her bones. The cigarettes stayed gone, though she still caught herself reaching for them on tough days. And the first 3 habits? They started to stick. She roasted kale from the garden, bugs be damned, savoring the crisp, earthy taste. She walked 25 minutes now, then 30, the pine-scented air filling her lungs. Sleep came easier, 2 7 hours some nights, the nightmares fading into softer dreams. One evening, Evelyn sat with her notebook, flipping through pages of scribbles. Kale, edible. Walk, 30 minutes, no collapse. Sleep, 7 hours, no ghosts. She smiled, tracing the words. Her body felt different, less heavy, less fragile. Her mind, too. She picked up her bird book and read a passage about migration, the words sharp and clear, no blur. Then it happened, a memory slipped in, unbidden but gentle. She and Tom on a trail, watching a hawk circle overhead. "Look at that," he'd said, his arm around her. Free as anything. Tears welled up, but this time they didn't hurt. She wiped her face and whispered, "I miss you, but I'm still here." The change wasn't loud or sudden, it was quiet, like the fog lifting from the pines. At book club, she shared a story from her teaching days, and the room erupted in laughter. On her walks, she waved to a neighbor she'd never spoken to, and he waved back. In meditation, she pictured the hawk, soaring, and felt her own wings stirring. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was reaching, growing, living. The podcast had promised 6 habits, and they were weaving into her days, stitching her back together. But the real turning point came one rainy afternoon. Evelyn stood in her garden, the kale patchy but alive, rain dripping down her coat. She thought about the years she'd lost to grief, to stillness, and the years she might still have. What if I'd started sooner? She wondered. Then she shook her head. No, what if I'd never started at all? The question hung there, heavy and bright. What if you're waiting for the perfect moment to change, when the only moment that matters is now? She didn't have all the answers, but she had something better: proof. Proof that 72 wasn't too late, that 6 little habits could crack open a life she'd thought was sealed shut. Evelyn walked back inside, her sneakers leaving muddy prints, and opened her notebook. She wrote, "Day 45, I'm not the same." The pines swayed outside, whispering secrets she was finally ready to hear. 3 habits had shaken her, 3 more were lifting her. Where could they take her next? 6 months had passed since Evelyn pressed play on that podcast, and the little wooden house in suburban Oregon no longer felt like a tomb. The fog still rolled in most mornings, curling around the pines, but now it carried a promise, a quiet, steady hum of life. Evelyn stood in her backyard, mud on her boots, a basket of kale in her arms. The garden wasn't perfect, half the leaves bore tiny holes from stubborn bugs, but it was hers, green and thriving despite the odds. She inhaled the damp, earthy air and smiled. At 72, she'd thought her best days were behind her. She'd been wrong. The 6 habits had taken root, slow and messy at first, like seeds in rocky soil. Eating better had become a ritual: kale salads with olive oil, carrots roasted until sweet, a handful of walnuts she'd started keeping on the counter. No more canned soup, no more skipping meals. Her walks were a daily dance, now 30 minutes along the trail, sometimes 40, the pines her silent cheerleaders. She'd traded her creaky shuffle for a steady stride, her knees grumbling less with each step. Sleep wrapped around her like a warm blanket, 8 hours most nights, the TV off by 9, the wind through the open window her lullaby. The nightmares of Tom calling her name had faded, replaced by dreams of hawks soaring over endless forests. The other 3 habits had sealed the change. Book club wasn't just a Thursday thing anymore, it was a lifeline. Margaret and the others had become friends, real ones. They'd sit on Evelyn's porch some evenings, sipping tea, swapping stories about lost loves and new hopes. Meditation had stretched to 15 minutes, a sacred pause where she'd sit cross-legged on the couch, breathing in the stillness. The cigarettes? Gone for good. She'd replaced them with a habit of sketching birds, trees, the garden, her pencil scratching paper instead of her lungs. But the proof wasn't just in her routine, it was in her bones, her mind, her soul. She felt it in the mornings when she woke without that old fog of exhaustion, her eyes clear as she read her nature books. She saw it in the mirror, lines still etched her face, but her cheeks had color, her gaze had spark. She heard it in her voice at book club, strong and sure, spinning tales of ospreys and redwoods that left the room hanging on her words. Evelyn wasn't just living longer, she was living better, and she wanted to shout it from the rooftop. It's not too late. One crisp October day, she decided to prove it to herself, to the world. She invited her book club friends to her house, a small gathering to mark 6 months of change. She spent the day cooking roasted vegetables, a pot of soup simmering with herbs she'd grown herself. The house smelled alive again, not of damp wood and neglect, but of warmth and purpose. Margaret arrived first, carrying a loaf of homemade bread, followed by the others, their voices filling the rooms. Evelyn set the table with mismatched plates, her hands steady, her heart full. They ate, laughed, and when someone asked about her garden, she led them outside, pointing to the kale with a grin. "It fought the bugs and won," she said, "just like me." After dinner, they sat by the fireplace, the crackle of logs mingling with their chatter. Evelyn pulled out her notebook, not the old spiral one, but a new leather-bound journal she'd bought herself. "I've been writing something," she said, her voice soft but firm. She opened it and read aloud. "6 months ago, I was fading. I thought 72 was the end of the road. Then I found 6 habits, or they found me. Eating green, walking tall, sleeping deep, connecting, calming, letting go. They didn't just add years, they gave me back my life." The room went quiet, the firelight dancing in their eyes. Margaret reached over, squeezed her hand. "You should finish that book, Evelyn," she said. "People need to hear this." That night, after they had gone, Evelyn stood in her kitchen, washing dishes by the glow of a single lamp. She thought about the years she'd lost to grief, the days she'd spent curled in that armchair, waiting for time to run out. Then she thought about now friends on her porch, a garden in her yard, a story in her hands. She dried her hands, walked to the mirror, and looked at herself. Gray hair, yes. Wrinkles, sure. But the woman staring back wasn't fading anymore. She was growing. "I'm not just living longer," she said aloud, her voice steady. "I'm living better." The climax came the next morning. Evelyn sat at her table, the journal open, her pencil flying across the pages. She wrote about the kale that wouldn't quit, the walks that rebuilt her, the nights she reclaimed. She wrote about Margaret's laugh, the stillness of meditation, the smoke she'd banished. She poured it all out, the stumbles, the breakthroughs, the quiet victories. When she finished, she titled it, 6 Habits, 1 Life. It wasn't just a record, it was a gift, a map for anyone who thought their best years were gone. She imagined her granddaughter reading it someday, or a stranger at the library, and smiled. This was her legacy, not of loss, but of fight. She stepped outside, the Oregon sun breaking through the pines, casting gold across the garden. The air was cool, sharp, alive. Evelyn closed her eyes, breathed deep, and felt it, the weight of 72 years, yes, but also the lightness of starting over. The podcast had been right. 6 everyday habits could hint at how many years you had left. But they'd done more than that. They'd rewritten her story, turned a quiet fade into a loud, vibrant bloom. And here's the thing, the truth that hit her as she stood there, the truth she'd scrawl on the last page of her book. These 6 habits don't just add years to your life, they add life to your years. It was a line that burned in her chest, a torch she wanted to pass on. She pictured you. Yes, you, watching this unfold, maybe sipping coffee in your own quiet house. And she wondered, what's holding you back? What tiny step could you take today to rewrite your tomorrow? Evelyn didn't know how many years she had left, no one does. But as she walked back inside, her journal under her arm, her muddy boots tracking life across the floor, she knew one thing for sure. Whatever time she had, she'd make it count. The pines whispered their approval, and for the first time in years, she whispered back, "I'm here."